9. Feminine sexuality. Introductory remarks. Patriarchy. Derrida's remark that the withdrawal of the did leads towards the other sexual difference condenses his criticism of the binary determination of sexual difference not in the name of a hysterical proliferation of differences, which amounts to a covert promotion of sameness, but in the name of a difference that is the equivalent of Lacan's notion of the traumatic real. 1. In what follows, I aim to establish the basis for linking this difference between two kinds of difference, binary difference and difference, to the Lacanian account of, dealt with in part 4, by arguing that for Derrida the did, or binary difference, to be withdrawn is an effect of what one could call a masculine libidinal operation, whereas the other sexual difference is an effect of a feminine libidinal operation. One might immediately suspect this sex-specific labeling, but, as I shall try to explain before turning to Derrida's reading of Nietzsche's Spurs, both Derrida and Lacan have good, subversive reasons for retaining this nomenclature. For both thinkers, these libidinal operations must be understood as structural or non-contingent universals insofar as these universals are real. They are essentially not yet either feminine or masculine. Instead, their contingently given, manifest character or meaning, for example, as specifically feminine or masculine operations, is an effect of the unconscious symbolic order, the big other, that underpins contemporary 261 social life. Speaking in general terms, Lacan's symbolic order names the unspoken rules that tacitly govern any language game or discourse. As Vis-a vis points out, these unspoken rules are, for example, responsible for all the stereotypes and obligatory scenes from whose invidious comfort one may find a degree of relief in non-Hollywood movies. Two such tacit rules tend to remain implicit, subtle, and unremarkable until something goes wrong, does not work out, or seems amiss. Indeed, their very existence, if not their precise character, is always clearer to outsiders, particularly to those who, having transgressed them without knowing it, stand mystified by the behavior of associates. The economic logic of the did, of binary thinking, may be explained as precisely an attempt to tie the unspoken rules of a discourse into a secure and determinate system by binding them all to a central point, the capital or quilting point, a desired master signifier that guarantees the consistency of the big other, and subsequently to defend its hegemony against both external forces and internal corruption. 3. According to Lacan, the phallus is a generic term that covers all of the particular, contingent determinations of this quilting point. In Lacan's words, it is the signifier intended to designate as a whole the effects of the signified, in that the signifier conditions them by its presence as a signifier, for it therefore has many nicknames: center, transcendental, signified, master signifier, to which we may now add empty signifier, and zero institution. In other words, it is a generic term for that which would give unity, consistency, sense, or truth to a discourse were it only achievable or accessible. Which it is not. Yet it is unconsciously accepted, as noted with Vis-a vis in the previous chapter, that the rules of a discourse form a coherent or meaningful system, knotted together at a quilting point, even though nobody knows precisely how to determine it, and inevitably, when put to the test, the consequence is irresolvable conflict over what it really means. 5. Phallic logic accordingly names the operation by which we attempt to secure the discourse by giving specific content to the empty signifier. Again, there are plenty of nicknames for this operation. One may call it, for example, the economic agraria, a paranoid libidinal style, a dream of totality, or the logic of the law and its constitutive exclusion. Importantly, as Vis-a vis notes, Lacan emphasizes that the quilting points specified in phallic logic are contingently determined impositions, each of which is, as much as any other, only a relatively adequate appropriation of the real and therefore in some sense a fabrication, fake, or necessary fiction, an empty signifier without a signified adopted for the sarcasm of consistency and efficiency. 6. If this is so, each determinate quilting point essentially 262 remains an enigma. In Vis-a-vis words, suffice it to recall how a community functions. The master signifier that guarantees the community's consistency is a signifier whose signified is an enigma for the members themselves. Nobody really knows what it means, but each of them somehow presupposes that others know it, that it has to mean the real thing, and so they use it all the time. 7. As a consequence of this inability to put a finger on the precise character of the knot that ties together the rules of a discourse, one faces the dialectical trouble Lacan names the mugger's choice. Those who do insist on defining precisely what the knot is entangle themselves in the economic agraria, described in Lacanian terms as the agraria of the law and its constitutive exception. Paradoxically, as Zizek explains it, every universal series involves the exclusion of an exception. All men have inalienable rights, with the exception of madmen, criminals, primitives, the uneducated, children, etc. 8. In an effort to avoid the agraria of the law and its constitutive exception, one might simply refuse to determine the knot, yet in the absence of any universal condition or predicate for the series or set, all members of the set become exceptions. In this case, one becomes entangled in the economic agraria, since each member of the set is unique. All generalizations are rejected as violations, making it utterly impossible to claim there are more or less suitable or responsible appropriations of the real. This mugger's choice has already been encountered in Chapter 7, articulated by Copy as the problem of the all. Notably, as Vis-a-vis points out, Lacan's point, of course, is that psychoanalysis should enable the subject to break with this safe reliance on the enigmatic master signifier without, one should add, falling into hysterical nihilism. Addressed more specifically in terms of sexual difference, phallic logic represents the effort to make sense of what in truth remains only a structural, antagonistic gap between libidinal styles marked by the empty signifier sexual difference by grouping certain traits under the banner of masculinity and insisting that the opposing traits are feminine. 9. The fact that sexual difference remains an empty signifier is supported by lengthy history of shifting and conflicting interpretations tied to biological predispositions, genitalia, testosterone levels, reproductive function, prehistoric division of labor, religion, patriarchal power relations, various feminisms, and so on. Patriarchy is by no means the only example of phallic logic, but it is, as Vis-a-vis puts it, the most efficient. According to patriarchal dictates, the quilting point is defined as the true law of masculine superiority, while the constitutive exception is, accordingly, feminine weakness. It is no secret, then, that in the condition of patriarchy, marked by the logic of the 263 law and its constitutive exception, the testosterone-induced traits that do indeed predominate in actual, biological men are taken to constitute an exclusive constellation of predicates that delimit the set of real men. According to this process of reductive definition, then, the set of real men excludes real women as its binary opposite. As an effect of such binary thinking, all real women, accordingly, do not possess the specified masculine traits. Patriarchy relies on a clear-cut binary order, in whose name the insistent grey areas of ordinary factical existence become signs of freakish anomaly and corruption to be strongly resisted and ultimately eradicated in the brave new world of future binary purity. As the logic of clear-cut binary oppositions and hierarchical privilege, phallic logic also privileges itself above other logics, for example, the contaminated logic of paradox, as the path to a true account of the worldly state of affairs. It is in the overlap between these two domains of privilege in a patriarchy that the link is forged between masculinity and phallic logic. I should again emphasize that this link is entirely contingent. Masculinity as contingently defined in a patriarchy is contingently tied to phallic logic, which, again contingently, privileges the values of security, totality, system, order, reason, hierarchy, economy, universality, and so on, as the order of truth. Finally, subjects contingently born into a patriarchy enter a circle of reinforcement whereby actual biological men are encouraged to adopt phallic logic, since it offers them unlearned supportive affirmation, whereas actual biological women are, as Freud noticed, better candidates for hysterical rebellion, since they are automatically excluded from the domain of privilege and are therefore more likely to remain skeptical concerning the truth value of phallic logic. In other words, one is more likely to be reflective, resentful, hostile, and critical toward a superego that devalues what one is not through choice but by birth. Nevertheless, there is no necessity involved here, for non-contingent reasons. Despite a massive, global effort to establish and maintain its hegemony, this quilting point of masculine privilege, or, that is, the binary that establishes this privilege on the basis of the feminine exception, necessarily remains an enigmatic empty signifier. In consequence, as Vis-a-vis notes, the symbolic law, paternal name, is just one, the most efficient or established, in the series of imposed, relatively fictional systematizations, none of which ever reflect the truth of sexual difference, since the truth of sexual difference is that the term in itself has no precise meaning but remains traumatic. Yet, and here is the double bind, one cannot do without meaning. While all such relatively fictional systematizations of sexual difference are 264 not, of course, natural or true, they nevertheless have powerful and important actual effects in the world, and the actual or effective political struggles concerning sexual difference take place in this arena of fabricated meaning. Moreover, once established, meanings remain inertial. The difficulty concerning patriarchy, then, does not concern the claim that the meaning of sexual difference is fabricated. Phallic logic is always necessary in order to avoid the other extreme of hysterical dissolution. Thus, even if, as Nietzsche was quick to point out, many feminisms equally represent examples of phallic logic, and, as much as patriarchy, run the risk of paranoid protectiveness, that is, ironically, they risk becoming masculine, one should not give up on them in favor of the kind of proliferation of difference that gives way to sameness. This, as noted earlier, due to the inertial dominance of patriarchy, inevitably turns out to favor masculinity in any case. Feminism, then, cannot oppose patriarchal fabrication with either the hysterical shattering of all acts of fabrication or so-called feminist truth. Instead, its best option is to offer a more salutary fabrication. This, however, presupposes the prior work of shaking patriarchal subjects out of their lethargic tendency to forget that all meaning-giving is a matter of fabrication rather than truth, and out of their paranoid attempts to assert the absolute dominance of what remains merely an imposition of value, even if patriarchy is no longer always inscribed in formal law and the situation is undoubtedly more fluid for some. Conventional practices and values are tardy in catching up with the law. One way of proceeding is to untie the illegitimate associations, reductions, privileges, and evaluations underpinning the mutually reinforcing connection between phallic logic and patriarchy. Such deconstructive activity, as feminists such as Lacan and Derrida have demonstrated, arrives at the traumatic condition of the enigmatic phallus, thereby opening patriarchal discourse up to something beyond the phallic did, or, that is, patriarchy's masculine/feminine binary. In other words, they aim to uncover another sexuality, which takes shape as a libidinal style that exceeds the binary altogether. If, in a condition of patriarchy, the phallic did is called masculine, this other sexuality could just as well be called feminine, but in this case it would not be a femininity defined in relation to the masculine as its binary opposite. It is for political reasons, in sum, that both Derrida and Lacan consciously disrupt the inertial, patriarchal interpretations of sexual difference, not simply by reversing the binary, for example, retaining a traditionally masculine conception of the ethical domain and simply turning it over to the feminine, but rather by revaluing traditional values, including ethics, castration, truth, system, reason, and so on, according to 265 another logic, a feminine operation that exceeds the mugger's choice between binaries. In the chapters to follow, I shall lay out Lacan's account of the transcendental relation as an articulation, isomorphic with the plural logic of the agoria, of 1. The binary division, imposed by phallic logic, between masculine paranoia and feminine hysteria, and 2. The other feminine sexuality that exceeds it through embracing the logic of paradox. First, however, I propose to show in more detail that Derrida's thinking concerning accords with Lacan's, by addressing Derrida's reading, in spurs, of a rather unlikely figure, Nietzsche. Like Lacan, Derrida takes the risk of supposing that woman is the figure of paradox, that is, difference. He imposes this reading on Nietzsche with an ever so gentle inventive twist of interpretation whose butterfly effect yields a dramatic revaluation of values. Derrida reading Nietzsche, supposing truth is a woman, what then? The power of moral prejudices has penetrated deeply into the most spiritual world, which would seem to be the coldest and most devoid of presuppositions, and has obviously operated in an injurious, inhibiting, blinding, and distorting manner. A proper physiopsychology has to contend with unconscious resistance in the heart of the investigator. It has the heart against it. 10 In a philosophical milieu that could not abide contamination, Nietzsche's unconventional style of thinking, as noted in Chapter 1, announced itself rebelliously as the midwife of a new breed of philosopher, whose time is still to come. The philosophical tradition, to recall his view, under the pressure of its will to power is subject to a dynamic of self-poisoning whose outcome is the dogmatist's fake truth, or, that is, any ideology driven by an imaginary power to determine fixed, universal values for supposedly oppositional terms, whole/part, self/other, good/evil, etc., and on this basis lay fundamental grounds for science, morality, aesthetics, and so on. Nietzsche, by contrast, insists upon the necessity of overcoming this will to power and liberating thinking by recognizing and negotiating a complex logic of contamination that eschews any simplistic division of the world according to antithetical values, or, that is, resists a traditional faith in binary thinking. In short, his analysis of the inevitable dynamic of self-poisoning associated with the will to power and consequent insistence upon an overcoming that resists its ideological outcome 266 through recognizing the truth as untruth inscribed in the logic of contamination demonstrates his understanding of truth as a complex, paradoxical notion. If the aim of Nietzsche's logic of contamination is to free philosophical thinking from its conservative tendency toward restrictive categorization in terms of binary values, one might justifiably anticipate a complex and subtly nuanced analysis of reciprocal contamination concerning the concepts truth and woman in response to the question posed in the first words of the preface to Beyond Good and Evil. Supposing truth is a woman, what then? If truth is a woman, Nietzsche answers, then her lovers, the dogmatic philosophers, have been exceedingly clumsy in their efforts to win her, and, indeed, none has succeeded nor will succeed, since philosophical methods are inappropriately designed nets for this butterfly. In short, just as traditional men are characterized by their inability to understand what women want, so traditional philosophy is constructed so as to ensure that philosophers will never understand the nature of the prize they seek, namely, truth. As this answer indicates, on Nietzsche's account the notion truth juxtaposes two versions of a paradoxical truth as untruth. 1. The philosopher's truth, which is in actual fact an untruth born of a misunderstanding that imagines there is some truth that can be discovered, captured, and pinned by the right method, and 2. The truth of the actual state of affairs, namely, a state of contamination, gradations, nuances, paradoxes, or agorias, which dogmatic philosophy is not designed to capture. To accept this truth is to recognize that ultimate truth is a fantasy projected into the past or future to serve a dogmatic desire for metaphysical closure. In different senses, then, the notion truth is found to be contaminated at the core by its opposite, namely, untruth on the basis of these two versions of the truth as untruth. Nietzsche may have drawn two radically different kinds of analogy between truth and women, one confirming sedimented, ideological values associated with women and the other paving the way for their salutary ruin. This is precisely the proposition Derrida examines in addressing Nietzsche's rhetorical use of women as an analogy for truth in Spurs. Without doubt, as Derrida acknowledges, there is a plurality of women in Nietzsche's texts. There is no such thing as a woman, as a truth in itself of women in itself, i.e., woman does not exist. That much, at least, Nietzsche has said. Not to mention the manifold topology of women in his work, its horde of mothers, daughters, sisters, old maids, wives, governesses, prostitutes, virgins, grandmothers, big and little girls 11. However, it is clear enough that the predominant, explicit move in Beyond Good and 267 Evil is to draw a single analogy between truth and woman which aims to condemn the philosopher's truth by calling it feminized. This move, ironically, is a consequence of the very kind of ideological conditioning, here patriarchal, that his free thinking resists in principle. Yet, even if Nietzsche became a little seasick when thinking of women, Derrida insists that his logic of contamination is implicitly, perhaps unconsciously, already at work in his writings concerning women, if one reads a little inventively. Reading Nietzsche inventively, then, Derrida argues that in such notions as women a plurality of senses is gathered into a matrix of interrelations, which form not a unified system or ordered plurality but multiple aporias and paradoxes. Granting a margin of errance, entropic loss without reserve, or non-mastery as the essential limit of any effort at codification, without this being reason enough to choose sides with the heterogeneous or the parody, which would only reduce them once again, he risks proposing just such a matrix for reading Nietzsche's propositions concerning women. 12 In his words, rather than examine here the large number of propositions which treat of the woman, it is instead their principle, which might be resumed in a finite number of typical and matrical propositions, that I shall attempt to formalize. 13 His main line of argument is that Nietzsche typically makes at least three kinds of aporetic proposition relating truth and woman. The first links the traditional philosopher to the castrated woman he reviled, the second, the masked artist to the castrating woman he dreaded, and the third, the free thinker to the affirming woman he loved. 14 Derrida begins strategically by addressing the third proposition first, reading Nietzsche with a deliberately subversive twist that finds implicit in his text resources to undermine more obvious interpretations according to which Nietzsche condemns philosophy by calling it feminized. I shall deviate from the order of his argument here by first examining the analogy between truth and woman that Nietzsche explicitly draws in Beyond Good and Evil. Truth and the castrated woman. Nietzsche reviled. Nietzsche's opening question is intended clearly enough as a provocation directed at the tradition of systematic philosophy proceeding from the inventive Platonic inauguration, the sting of which is supposed to inhere in the analogy between the philosopher's truth and castrated/castrating women. Notably, for him, the philosopher's truth was not always a woman but became feminine at a historical juncture, namely, when 268 Plato made philosophy a matter of objectivity and intersubjectivity. The present philosophical tradition, then, is the span of decadent feminization between an illustrious inaugural moment of free thinking, marked by the paraphrase of original/originary singularity, namely, I Plato, am the truth, and the promise of a future in which the courage for such singular truth has been restored to man. 15 Nietzsche hopes that the future philosopher will have the courage to insist that my judgment is my judgment, no one else is easily entitled to it. 16. His logic of contamination tempts one to assume that he must have understood such truth to be an interminably negotiable interplay between the singular insight named my judgment and its intersubjective confirmation, or, in Derrida's terms, the play of signature and counter-signature, where signature stands proxy for my traumatizing power of invention and counter-signature stands for the curtailing, binding, and conservative force of convention, as a necessary condition for the repeatability and communicability of an invention. 17 Yet, contrary to the promise of his logic, Nietzsche's disdain for the other is such that he finds it fitting to condemn the feminized philosopher's truth further by calling it intersubjective. In his words, one must shed the bad taste of wanting to agree with many. Good is no longer good when one's neighbor mouths it. And how should there be a common good? The term contradicts itself. Whatever can be common always has little value. 18 Again, around every profound spirit a mask is growing continually, owing to the constantly false, namely shallow, interpretation of every word, every step, every sign of life he gives. 19 This inauspicious evaluation of the communal combines with a similarly unfavorable evaluation of women as the despicable figure of castration in the rhetoric by which he condemns the fake truth of the dogmatists and promotes instead the singular, masculine truth that belongs to the past and future. For Nietzsche, ironically enough, what castrates Plato is the obscene fantasy of monumental penile hypertrophy. The feminizing castration effect occurs because Plato does not view philosophizing as a matter of singular self-fashioning through subjectively one insight but dreams of the ultimate philosophical erection, or, psychoanalytically speaking, dreams of giving content to the phallus, making it stand for universal, ultimate, objective truth that lasts an eternity. 20 But in this case, as Derrida puts it, once this inaugural moment has given way to the second age, here where the becoming female of the idea is the presence or presentation of truth, Plato can no more say I am truth. For here the philosopher is no longer the truth. Severed from himself, he has been severed from truth. 21 Due 269 To this castration effect he adds, the idea withdraws, becomes transcendent, inaccessible, seductive. It beckons from afar. Its veils float in the distance. The dream of death begins. It is woman. 22 So begins, for Nietzsche, the ancient, eternal story of philosophers will to power. 23 A philosophical idea emerges, in his words, as an assumption, a hunch, indeed a kind of inspiration, most often a desire of the heart that has been filtered and made abstract. 24 Yet it is mistaken for a truth, not invented but discovered through cool, disinterested reason. Moreover, its universalization derives not from a will to truth but from an unconscious power lust. In his words, I do not believe that a drive to knowledge is the father of philosophy, but rather that another drive has, here as elsewhere, employed understanding and misunderstanding as a mere instrument. 25 Moreover, each such singular drive, he notes, would like only too well to represent just itself as the ultimate purpose of existence and the legitimate master of all the other drives. For every drive wants to be master, and it attempts to philosophize in that spirit. 26 This power lust, again speaking psychoanalytically, in turn becomes a death drive toward the absolute stasis of eternal validity. The castration effect is not limited to the singular individual who invented an idea and dreamed of its eternalization. Rather, universal ideas act at a distance from everyone, and as noted, Nietzsche insists that the more universally they are confirmed, the less substantial they become. This distance effect of castration renders an idea more beautiful or enchanting, perhaps, but all the more spectral. Thus cut off from a singularizing desire, the philosophical idea in its maturity is rendered as passionless as a woman, as superficial, vacuous, and decadent. On Nietzsche's testimony in Beyond Good and Evil, behind the spectral veils of dissimulating finery, woman bustles with petty trivia. She is false, irrational, erratic, unfaithful, weak-minded, superstitious, sentimental, animalistic, resistant to culture, swayed by emotional excess and fecund sexual urges, weak, soft, unfaithful, inconsistent, wily, cunning, sexually promiscuous, licentious, incontinent, decadent, claustrophobic, violent, unpredictable, vicious, nihilistic, frivolous. whimsical, heteronymous, swayed by love, particularistic, atavistic, uneducable, wild, and utterly incapable of free thinking. 27 Worst of all, for Nietzsche, philosophy's adherents become as skeptical as aged women. In his words, I am afraid that old women are more skeptical in their most secret heart of hearts than any man. They consider the superficiality of existence its essence, and all virtue and profundity is to them merely a veil over this truth, a very welcome veil over oppidum. In other words, a matter of decency and shame, and no more than 270 that 28 if philosophers, by analogy, have ever lifted the veils to see the abyssal flux that threatens the beautiful idea, then, like women, they cannot act resolutely upon this UN truth but veil the lack with their magnificent imaginary erections. Nietzsche raises an eyebrow at how little is considered sufficient support for such sublime and unconditional philosophers' edifices as the dogmatists have built so far. 29 Feet metaphysicians, then, knowing that their erections are soft inside, nevertheless go through the motions, lacking both passion and the imagination to will anything innovative. Skepticism, for Nietzsche, represents a paralysis of the will, timidly abdicating all responsibility. Skeptics no longer know independence of decisions and the intrepid sense of pleasure in willing 30 artistry and the castrating woman. Nietzsche dreaded taking the analogy with women further, for the beauty of a system or elegance of an argument is highly seductive. Nietzsche adds that woman castrates because she is castrated. As Derrida puts it, in fact, what is emblazoned in the it becomes female might be shown to be a she castrates herself. Castrated, she castrates and plays at her castration in the parenthetical epoch. She feigns her castration, which is at once suffered and inflicted. 31 This castration effect, in other words, works as follows. She is utterly skeptical about truth. On Nietzsche's account, woman does not want truth. 32 In fact, in answer to the question what is truth to woman, he claims, from the beginning, nothing has been more alien, repugnant, and hostile to woman than truth. Her great art is a lie. Her highest concern is mere appearance and beauty. If woman, as Derrida notes, is not the least interested in truth and does not believe in it, she is nevertheless canny enough to see that man needs truth. 33 As Nietzsche continues, let us men confess it, we honor and love precisely this art and this instinct in woman, we who have a hard time and for our relief like to associate with beings under whose hands, eyes, and tender follies our seriousness, our gravity and profundity almost appear to us like folly. It is in her interest to fake the truth. She uses her seductive arts of dissimulating adornment to confound the credulous men into believing in the illusion of their power to win her, to pin her down, and in so doing she secures her power over them. As Nietzsche warns, she surely wants to inspire fear of herself. By analogy, then, traditional philosophers, while skeptical in the innermost recesses of their hearts, still deceive, beguile, and seduce others with cunning promises of elevation and delight, so mastering their desires and cutting them off from the freedom of their own inventive powers. 271 But in reverse action, woman also castrates herself. She is unequaled, Nietzsche claims, in the art of seducing one's neighbor to a good opinion and afterwards believing piously in this opinion. 34 Analogously, philosophers, having mistakenly, if inevitably, configured the world to suit themselves, force this invention on themselves and others for so long that they can no longer remember the invented status of their own ideas, and, coming in this way to believe in them, they succumb to ideological tyranny. In criticism of the Stoics, for example, Nietzsche argues, for all your love of truth, you have forced yourself so long, so persistently, so rigidly hypnotically to see nature the wrong way, namely stoically, that you are no longer able to see her differently. 35 In its feminized form, then, philosophy can only gauge its effect of truth through intersubjective confirmation, but the success with which it deceives others beguiles its adherents into self-deception. Like women, philosophers become enchanted by the beauty of the disguise and aggressively paranoid about preserving the deception, growing poisonous in their aim to eradicate in others the very kind of inventive life that engendered their own power. 36 As Derrida sums it up, she castrates in order to master the master from a distance. In his words, from afar she would master the master and with the same blow, in fact the same thing, that produced his desire, kill him. 37 Her artistry, therefore, aiming to deceive, manipulate, stunt, and control, lacks innovative power and stagnates. It becomes a stultifying power of death that is hostile to life, and since life itself is will to power, her desire poisons the will to power. 38 Analogously, then, for Nietzsche, philosophy castrates philosophers. His words here could be taken for any contemporary account of the power within a discourse to speak a subject. That individual philosophical concepts are not anything capricious or autonomously evolving, but grow up in connection and relationship with each other, that however suddenly and arbitrarily they seem to appear in the history of thought, they nevertheless belong just as much to a system as all the members of the fauna of a continent, is betrayed in the end also by the fact that the most diverse philosophers keep filling in a definite fundamental scheme of possible philosophies. Under an invisible spell, they always revolve once more in the same orbit, however independent of each other they may feel themselves with their critical or systematic wills, something within them leads them, something impels them in a definite order, one after the other, to wit, the innate systematic structure and relationship of their concepts. Their thinking is, in fact, far less a discovery than a recognition, a remembering, a return and a homecoming. 272 To a remote, primordial, and inclusive household of the soul, out of which those concepts grew originally. Philosophizing is to this extent a kind of atavism of the highest order. 39 Nietzsche clearly despises all ideological conditioning as an effect of the supposedly feminine system of castration. Beware, he warns, of suffering for the sarcasm of truth. It makes you headstrong against objections and red rags. It stupefies, animalizes, and brutalizes when in the struggle with danger, slander, suspicion, expulsion and even worse consequences of hostility. You have to pose as protectors of truth upon earth. 40 His injunction to the freethinkers of the future, therefore, is to overcome the poisonous feminine will to power, or to keep one's distance from women. His new philosophers will be severe men who have no time to waste on the cunning feminine falsity of philosophical untruth, no wish to be pleasured or amused by her. In his words, they will be harder, and perhaps not always only against themselves, than humane people might wish. They will not dally with truth to be pleased or elevated or inspired by her. On the contrary, they will have little faith that truth of all things should be accompanied by such amusements for our feelings. They will smile, these severe spirits, if somebody should say in front of them, this thought elevates me, how could it fail to be true? Or, this work delights me, how could it fail to be beautiful? Perhaps they do not merely have a smile but feel a genuine nausea over everything that is enthusiastic, idealistic, feminine, hermaphroditic in this vein. 41 Accordingly, Nietzsche claims that free thinking occurs beyond the castrated and castrating dream of establishing universal laws grounded by objectively determined philosophical systems or principles, which merely organize existing conventional values into neat binary categories, for example, of good or evil. But he dismisses as nihilistic the option of keeping an absolute or pure distance from women, that is, of mere rebellious destruction in response to ideological forms, which invent nothing to replace the devastation of value. Indeed, he insists, the same means in the fight against a craving, castration, extirpation, is instinctively chosen by those who are too weak-willed, to degenerate, to be able to impose moderation on themselves. 42 Notably, if invention must take place, there is no getting outside of the will to power. I will return to this. Instead, Nietzsche's free thinking becomes a matter of deliberate self-legislation. The notion of autonomy is hardly new, but he insists that autonomy conventionally understood has always still been a heteronomy. 273 The dictatorship of all-powerful reason. Proposing that independent thinking obeyed the rigors of reason rather than blindly accepting traditional forms, philosophy assumed that what was discovered through reason shorn not only of prejudice and habit but also of disorders such as paradox and agraria could in principle command universal agreement. Nietzsche, however, insists that the true state of affairs belongs within the domain of agraria, paradox, dilemma, contamination, which conventional reason cannot abide. For him, to face the truth is to recognize untruth as a condition of life, which means putting all conventional values at risk by facing the abyss that replaces them. A philosophy that risks this, he adds, would by that token alone place itself beyond good and evil. 43 To sum up so far, under the rubric of castration, Nietzsche equates the becoming ideology of a philosophy under the pressure of the will to power with its feminization. Rejecting outright destruction of all value as nihilistic, he heralds and commends a self-affirmative, inventive free thinking as the condition for overcoming the feminization of philosophy and, moreover, for opening the way for genuinely ethical action. Such free thinking, which empowers thinkers, on the one hand, to keep their distance from feminized philosophy, and on the other, to face and overcome nihilism, is placed squarely within the ostensibly hard, masculine domain of brutal honesty about the truth as untruth. Yet, pressed by a firmer commitment to Nietzsche's logic of contamination, Derrida recognizes that the free thinking he heralds demands equal attention to the alternative supposition that it is the free thinker's truth as untruth rather than the elusive object of the philosopher's desire. That is analogous to woman free thinking and the affirming woman. Nietzsche loved reading Nietzsche against the grain. Derrida aims to show that a small inventive twist in interpretative reading enables one to derive an opposing evaluation of the feminine from Nietzsche's analogy between truth and woman, aiming, as mentioned, to bring forth the most unconventional reading first, before the weight of convention crushes it out. He elicits from a scrap of the gay science what can only be the thinnest of whispers, a barely audible spectral sound that hovers above the word distance. 44 But let us play along with Derrida here and allow him to summon this ghost for us, for it represents a significant element of his matrix. In the fragment Derrida cites here, Nietzsche imagines the effect of women on men to be like the sudden appearance, to a man standing amidst the 274 crashing breakers of a stormy sea, of a great ship in the distance, which passes like an immense butterfly over the dark sea, as Nietzsche puts it, as if born out of nothing. There appears before the gate of this hellish labyrinth, only a few fathoms away, a large sailboat, gliding along as silently as a ghost. Oh, what ghostly beauty! How magically it touches me! Has all the calm and taciturnity of the world embarked on it? Does my happiness itself sit in this quiet place? It seems as if the noise here had led me into fantasies. All great noise leads us to move happiness into some quiet distance. When a man stands in the midst of his own noise, in the midst of his own surf of plans and projects, then he is apt also to see quiet, magical beings gliding past him and to long for their happiness and seclusion, women. He almost thinks that his better self dwells there among the women, and that in these quiet regions even the loudest surf turns into deathly quiet, and life itself into a dream about life. If the almost is not enough to break the enchantment, Nietzsche, in explicit confirmation of the analogy first drawn, issues this warning, yet, noble enthusiast, even on the most beautiful sailboat there is a lot of noise, and unfortunately much small and petty noise. The magic and the most powerful effect of woman is, in philosophical language, action at a distance, actio in distance, but this requires first of all and above all, distance. I have already outlined in what sense for Nietzsche this action at a distance inscribes the entire system of castration in which philosophy has been trapped since Plato. Yet for Derrida, in the phrase action at a distance there is enough of a symptomatic slip to suggest, contra the conscious Nietzsche, that woman is the quintessential figure of the free thinker he heralds as the philosopher of the future. Derrida, in other words, here deliberately takes up an association between woman and truth as untruth in the second sense outlined above, instead of the more obvious association between woman and the philosopher's truth. Taking up Nietzsche's injunction to keep one's distance from the feminine operation as well as his insistence that the feminine operation is an effect at a distance, Derrida makes the subtle shift whose butterfly effect is a radical transvaluation of the values of sexual difference. To begin with, he plays along with Nietzsche. In his words, a woman seduces from a distance. In fact, distance is the very element of her power. Yet one must beware to keep one's own distance from her beguiling song of enchantment. A distance from distance must be maintained. 45 275 The injunction to maintain a distance from distance then, is the injunction to keep one's distance from the feminine operation, from the actio in distance, or, that is, to become reflectively aware of it. Such reflection upon the feminine operation, Derrida notes, and here is the shift, does not amount to approaching it. Rather, tacitly invoking the myth of the veil of Isis, he insists, one approaches the feminine operation at the risk of death itself. 46 Why? It might be because woman is not some determinable thing comparable to other things, waiting there at a distance, to be approached, inspected, dissected, and pinned down, or ignored and left behind. Perhaps as he puts it, woman, a non-identity, a non-figure, a simulacrum, is distance's very chasm, the outdistancing of distance, the interval's cadence, distance itself, if we could still say such a thing, distance itself. 47 In other words, to put it bluntly, Derrida does not interpret the phrase a woman seduces from a distance to imply, as Nietzsche would have it, that a woman is only beautiful and enchanting at a distance, for when you approach her, or, that is, if you are brutally honest, there is nothing but a superficial facade veiling an ugly decadence. Rather, Derrida takes it to imply that woman is another name for the operation of difference. On the one hand, its operation as spacing acknowledges Nietzsche's truth as untruth, or, that is, the unstable, open-ended state of contamination or uncontrollable proliferation of differences that characterizes the actual state of affairs. On the other hand, the operation of difference as temporalization acknowledges that, for anything at all to take shape, one must violently put the play of differences out of play for a while, that is, restrict or defer the play or place it in reserve. To know that difference as temporalization violates difference as spacing and vice versa is to know that what takes shape via the operation of difference as temporalization could never be an eternal essence, an unconditionally present term, but must always be a necessary but temporary fiction, a making sense or an invention that does not forever escape the undermining forces of difference as spacing. Thus, on Derrida's reading, one can take the effect at a distance that names the feminine operation to mean that there is no such thing as the essence of woman because woman averts, she is averted of herself. Out of the depths, endless and unfathomable, she engulfs and distorts all vestige of essentiality, of identity, of property. And the philosophical discourse, blinded, founders on these shoals and is hurled down these depthless depths to its ruin. There is no such thing as the truth of woman, but it is because of that abyssal divergence of the truth, because that untruth is truth. Woman is but one name for that untruth of truth. 48 276 Derrida implicitly challenges one to reread all of the statements in which Nietzsche insists upon drawing an analogy between truth and woman or the veiled movement of feminine modesty or upon the complicity, rather than the unity, between woman, life, seduction, modesty in a way that strengthens the proposition that woman is the name for the salutary truth that characterizes the actual state of affairs. Take for example the following statement, but perhaps this is the greatest charm of life, it puts a golden embroidered veil of lovely potentialities over itself, promising, resisting, modest, mocking, sympathetic, seductive. Yes, life is a woman. 49. This statement could imply, as Derrida suggests, that woman as UN truth is one of the nicknames for a difference that remains distant, inaccessible, abyssal, and both seduces and mocks the credulous and dogmatic philosopher who understands nothing of truth, nor anything of woman if he believes in truth just as he believes in woman. 50. Moreover, she is implicitly wiser than he is, for, in Derrida's words, if woman is truth, she at least knows that there is no truth, that truth has no place here and that no one has a place for truth. And she is woman precisely because she herself does not believe in truth itself, because she does not believe in what she is, in what she is believed to be, in what she thus is not. 51. In a similar vein, Derrida takes Nietzsche's answer to the question that opens beyond good and evil to suggest the following: if truth is a woman, it remains in excess of what it seems at face value, and any philosopher who tries to capture truth makes of it a lie. As Nietzsche admits soon after, what is certain is that she has not allowed herself to be one, and today every kind of dogmatism is left standing dispirited and discouraged. If it is left standing at all, it is self-affirming woman who actively limits the tyrannical dream of philosophy. In Derrida's words, woman, truth, will not be pinned down. That which will not be pinned down by truth is, in truth, feminine. 52. The feminine is a power of self-affirmation that shakes off all ideology, including patriarchy. That is, she does not react against it but is unaffected by its power. Instead she affirms her own power. Woman, or the feminine, in this case is the quintessential figure of Nietzsche's new freethinker, who understands the truth that there is no truth without skepticism or passive nihilism but with cheerful inventive affirmation. Concluding remarks, the feminine as the site of transgression. What? In all honesty, it takes some Derridian subtlety and ingenuity to sustain this subversive gesture that makes Nietzsche let slip an alternative 277 valuation of the feminine effect at a distance by equating it with the self-affirmative, Dionysiac power of inventive renewal he endorses as the proper response to the abyss of truth as UN truth. Nevertheless, if Nietzsche did not have the stomach for the entire journey, it is important that Derrida, as one of the new thinkers he heralds, is of stronger constitution and is willing to risk supposing that truth as UN truth is a woman. From this transvaluation in the domain of sexual difference, it follows that dogmatic philosophy, demanding, as Derrida puts it, truth, science, and objectivity in all their castrated delusions of virility, not to speak of faith, continence, consistency, sublimation as sexual abstinence, universality, predictability, coldness, obedience to reason as system, law and order, duty, progress, educability, and bildung, must be understood as a matter of blind masculine narcissism rather than feminine deception. 53. In short, if Derrida accepts the complex logic of Nietzsche's new style of thinking, he resists the metaphorical configuration that characterizes his rhetoric, insisting instead that the becoming ideology of philosophy, the entire dynamic of castrated and castrating, is not a process of feminization but of masculinization. Ironically, to sum up, for all his perspicacity, Nietzsche did not foresee that the proverbial untimely character of his thinking would undergo a strange turnaround that renders it out of step not only with its own time but also with ours. He is par excellence the thinker beyond the castration effect of conventionally determined values and binary oppositions, and his free thinking is formally characterized by the permanent suspicion of all ideologies, which has become a powerful strand in the contemporary mindset. His own logic of contamination implies, of course, that he should have been the first to recognize patriarchy as a phallocentric ideology. Yet his rhetorical use of the epithet feminization to condemn the becoming ideology of philosophy relies for its effect on assuming the most stereotypical and conventional values for the concept woman given by this ideology of all ideologies that cuts across all discourses. It is therefore a stronger commitment to his style of thinking, on the part of the new thinkers he heralds, that uncovers an outdated, even quaint, patriarchal conventionality that dooms his pronouncements concerning sexual difference, buttressed by a stereotypical binary opposition between the communal and the singular, to a less romantic kind of untimeliness. The performative contradiction here seems obvious, in the very gesture by which he condemns the philosopher's truth as ideological and exhorts thinkers to move beyond conventionally given values and oppositions toward the complex style of deliberate free thinking he heralded. Nietzsche reveals that he remains unreflectively subject to precisely the kind of 278 conventional, ideological, heteronymous, and oppositional thinking he so strenuously resists in principle. Notably, acknowledging that the notion woman is characterized in his texts by a diverse plurality exacerbates the performative contradiction, for it strengthens the case that Nietzsche, of all thinkers, had the least reason to allow himself recourse in beyond good and evil, of all texts, to a rhetorical construct that criticizes traditional philosophy by calling it feminized. The obvious move here might be to retain the valuable critique of ideology made possible by his insight into the dynamic of the will to power as well as his logic of contamination while jettisoning the self-undermining, phallocentric rhetoric that constructs sexual difference in the terms handed down by patriarchy. However, as I hope to have demonstrated through the foregoing exposition of Derrida's reading, retaining these terms and pressing them to the point of their undoing has certain advantages. Nietzsche's unconscious recourse to commonly held stereotypes in turn puts into question the very possibility and value of absolute singularity, or, that is, truth as declamation, truth as the speaking of passion, desire, presupposed in the very possibility of saying I, Plato, am the truth. Nietzsche, as noted in chapter 1, argues that it is impossible to put the UN truth that I am into words. Yet, in a claim that is antagonistic to this insight, he insists that his own views concerning women are singular rather than a matter of learning. While he grants that learning, like nourishment, changes us, he insists that deep down lies an unteachable kernel from which speaks an unchangeable this is I described as the great stupidity we are, or as a spiritual fathom that remains unteachable very deep down. 54. Nietzsche, astonishingly, given his arguments for the impossibility of speaking passion, thinks that this preamble will more readily permit him to state a few truths, my emphasis, about women as such, assuming that it is now known from the outset how very much these are after all only my truths. It is precisely his logic of contamination that should have warned Nietzsche against claiming as his own truths the commonly held stereotypes he repeated concerning sexual difference. Moreover, this places into question his claim that the masculine UN truth inheres solely in the singular, inventive power of each rugged individual who must walk his own lonely path to insight, shaking off as degradation any confirmation and evaluation by what Ibsen called the compact majority. He might have reminded himself of what he already knew concerning the insidious, unconscious nature of ideological conditioning, for he remains perfectly aware that the free thinking required by a genuinely ethical stance, which 279 he understood in terms of a singular responsibility for independent decision-making, is less a matter of having the strength to stand up for and act upon individual convictions than of, above all, having the courage to question them, and not just intermittently, when things go wrong. 55 More radically, it is a matter of keeping such convictions permanently in question, since no thinkers can ever quite be honest enough in their work. 56 In other words, no individual, no matter how perspicacious, is capable of the absolute self-transparency required to master finally the undertow toward conventionality and habit inscribed in the will to power, precisely because it operates to a large extent unconsciously, which means that its effects only become visible in retrospect, when something has gone wrong with it. Nietzsche knew all of this, but he did not live up to his insight, allowing himself the greatest indulgence, in his own terms, the greatest weakness of spirit, when it came to the other in general, and particularly women. Turning to Nietzsche's new thinkers, whose style turns out to be feminine, one should immediately note that the feminine 57 as a site of transgression in a patriarchy, derived from the recognition of UN truth as the actual state of affairs, is not a matter of embracing anti-castration as the precise opposite of castration but a movement beyond the binary altogether. 58 women in Derrida's words, no more believes in castration's exact opposite, anti-castration, than she does in castration itself. Much too clever for that, and we ourselves, who we might learn from her, or in any case from her operation, she knows that such a reversal would only deprive her of the powers of simulation, that in truth a reversal of that kind would, in the end, only amount to the same thing and force her just as surely as ever into the same old apparatus. She knows that she would only find herself trapped once again in a phallocentrism. Interestingly, Derrida's prejudicial reading of Lacanian discourse surfaces briefly here. In his words, perhaps at this point one ought to interrogate and unboss the metaphorical full-blown sale of truth as declamation of the castration and phallocentrism. For example, in Lacan's discourse in the single stroke of one sentence, Derrida aims to align everything that calls for deconstruction in Nietzsche with what he sees as Lacan's poisonous will to power. The term unboss, de capitana, alludes to Lacan's point de capitan, generically named by the phallus, which Derrida apparently takes to reflect a phallocentric logic and a poisonous will to power that calls for deconstructive decapitation. His implicit challenge here turns on the puffed-up affectation that he detects and detests in the figure of truth as declamation in Lacan's discourse. That is, 280 underpinned by the claim that I, Lacan, am the truth. He sees Lacan inaugurating the movement of the castration effect in psychoanalytic discourse, which is further exacerbated by Lacan's castrating claim to a position of mastery in relation to his students and readers. Unlike self-affirming women then, Lacan, in Derrida's eyes, remains trapped within a paranoid masculine will to power. Admittedly, it might seem a stretch to suggest, to the contrary, that Lacanian psychoanalysis, like deconstruction, offers the theoretical means to take up Nietzsche's logic of contamination while liberating oneself from the prejudices concerning inter alia women and the other that undermine it. Yet if Derrida can trace a path through and beyond Nietzschean prejudice, not by rejecting outright his definition of the feminine in terms of lack or castration but by insisting that Nietzsche's logic of contamination supports a transvaluation of these values, there is no reason to suggest that Lacan could not have made a similar move in his reinterpretation of Freudian psychoanalysis. Freud, after all, is hardly more notorious than Nietzsche for defining women negatively, in terms of her lack of masculine accoutrements, and no more pessimistic in his assessment of the compact majority. In fact, the logic of Lacanian psychoanalysis operates precisely in terms of the transvaluation of values rather than the mere reversal of binaries, since it proposes a division in the feminine side of transgression, whereby transgression takes shape in two ways, namely the hysterically nihilistic will to pure destruction of all value that Nietzsche dismissed as another kind of feminine weakness, but also the self-affirmative domain of ethical action Nietzsche typically reserves for masculinity. For Lacan, then, as for Derrida, the moment of self-affirmative inventiveness that characterizes free thinking rightly belongs to femininity in a patriarchy, for it presupposes an initial willingness to transgress any established order of value and to face the prospect of nihilism. Against the current of the Derridean prejudice, then, in the following chapters, I aim to show that from Lacan's earliest writings, the plural logic of the aporia is at work in his psychoanalytic articulation of the transcendental relation, which, in fact, cannot do without it. If anything, this logic only becomes more explicit and its formulation more complex as his work progresses.